One of the most important protocols these days is the S3 protocol for object storage, application integrated object storage. But one of the things that occurs to some of us is that S3 is not it intended to be a protocol so much as it was an API for a cloud service. So when you're looking at various storage protocols, you can look at that one and be like, yeah, that's kind of accidentally a storage protocol. That's the topic of this roundtable discussion. I'm Stephen Foskett here with Storage Field Day 26 with a group of delegates, and we're going to be discussing that subject now. So, Voong, kick us off. This was something that came out of a conversation with you. Tell us about this accidental protocol.
Well, if you're in the storage industry, you're either architecting, or building, or using storage in the cloud. You've seen this thing come in conversation. S3 compatible, S3 storage. We do this. There was an interesting discussion here at SNIA SDC talking about, it's not all of them are the same. And I was like, well, no kidding, it's not the same because it's accidental. There are no standard bodies that create the S3, no published references that are hardcore and self-enforcing. So when you talk about SCSI, you get it. Talk about iSCSI, you get it. Everything else, NFS, but S3, there's no financial incentive for the people who created S3 to use it as a standardized protocol. They have no incentive. So they'll do what they want to do. They'll deprecate features. They'll change things on the fly. And yes, there is some documentation, but I would challenge anyone to tell me what is the definitive S3 feature set or what have you to use it.
But isn't the same if we talk about open standard and property standard, because the same sentence can be applied to SMB. SMB was a protocol, but proprietary protocol. Actually, we are talking a lot of SMB3 compatible, but maybe you don't have multipath or multi-session, you lose something. And at the beginning, a lot of reverse engineering was done on this kind of protocol. So maybe if something is born from a community, can be open, can be standard and compatible to the standard. But if you start something from a company and you need it, maybe you don't document or you don't expose all the feature. I don't know.
Well, that could be at an inflection point. If the S3 community, consumers, and other vendors decide, hey, we need to make this more standardized, then they could vie for that option. Yep. But today, like I said, there's no financial incentive for the creators of S3 to use that standard.
But there are some tester, S3 tester that are also funny because they say that some product XY is much more compatible than AWS S3.
that's almost like the cable testers, the USB-C cable testers I got the other day. I got this cable. Yeah. I don't know what it's going to do. I've got a product. It says S3 on the box. I don't know what it's going to do. I need to plug it into a tester and go, oh, look, that's what lights up. This one works. This one works. This can take power. And this one is like, I've done the same thing. Remember when Veeam started doing immutable backups on S3? And you go to your vendor, they go, oh, yeah, but we don't support immutability yet. Right, but I thought you said S3 on the box. Well, just the parts of S3 that seemed important at the time.
Oh. Yeah. Look, this is why we had, it's funny, we're at SNIA, the body that created standards in the storage industry for years. And on this very topic, there's a seminar coming up in a month or so on CDMI, which is their, cloud data management, is it interface? What are they?
Interface, probably, yeah.
Right, it's cloud data management interface version 2, right? Which is SNIA's answer to the exact question we're talking about, to make it less accidental. Except if you throw a party and nobody shows up, is it a party? And it's because, let's face it, the reason we're in the position we're in now is because Amazon just, they created the market and nobody caught up for years. They became the de facto standard, and nobody stopped that. And so now you got efforts like CDMI, which are now trying to put the horse back in the barn. It's going to be tough. I mean, there were other standards, right? We had Swift, right? And other object interfaces.
Object protocols.
And also the word protocol, it's an interesting
Yeah.
Is it really a
loaded-
protocol?
it's a
It's an
loaded
interface.
word.
It's an API.
Still an
REST
API.
Yeah,
is
yeah.
the protocol. HTTPS is the protocol.
That's true.
Right.
Yeah.
But but it depends where you're sitting. From a storage perspective, S3 is the protocol.
Well, this is just like the SCSI protocols where you have both a command protocol, which would be the S3 API protocol,
Right.
and then you have a transport protocol,
Yeah.
which in most cases would be HTTPS. And the command protocol or the API protocol pretty much has to stay the same because Amazon doesn't want to break a million different applications that are already built into their cloud space. If they changed it in an effort to break all of these other vendors that were out there, they would also break an awful lot of their customers. So it ends up being a standard simply because Amazon is not allowed to change it.
They can add to
do
it.
change it. They change it all the time. I mean, there is a WSDL file, file out there for the S3 API, and they iterate it all the time. I mean, you have things like STS. I guess I heard in one of the sessions yesterday, IBM has actually implemented STS. That's the first S3 compatible that I've heard of that actually makes a valiant attempt at trying to do so. Most
But-
don't.
But at the same time, it has to be backward compatible.
But
So you-
but,
Well,
but it doesn't. That's the but
Yeah.
with Amazon, they don't.
Whatever they want.
That's
Yeah.
just their way of doing things,
Because
right?
they're not
They just
beholden to
they
any.
do what
Right.
works for them, and to hell with if it hurts anybody else. So there are times where they break things because they own the protocol.
They have a technically
they have
they have a right to not let anybody use it.
So, more to the point. So, a couple things that I'm hearing in here that I have to say that I agree with. Number one, the question of is it a protocol or is it an interface, I think is a valid question. And the reason that's a valid question is because fundamentally S3, well, protocols, especially client server protocols, have to have, a client and a server. I don't think S3 was ever meant to have a server side to that protocol. It was always meant to be a client interface to a service, not a protocol. And I think that may sound like I'm splitting hairs, but I think it's important and it helps to inform all the stuff that we're dealing with here, because one of the reasons that it's so hard to say that S3 is a standard protocol is because there really is no server side standard, because the server side standard is supposed to be Amazon's S3 product.
Yeah.
That's the only thing the server and so
Service.
so the client side absolutely is standardized and has to be backward compatible and has to be supported and everything. But on the server side, well, it's a little different story, right?
yeah. Well, but I mean, you even look at like Azure Blob. It's not that in any way, shape, or form. It's a similar service, but if I fire the same commands at it, it's definitely not going to answer the same way.
But the other interesting part about that is seeing what Amazon had done with S3. Why didn't Microsoft take the Azure Blob interface? Shall we standardize on interface as the word of the day? In this case, why didn't they open source that or make that publicly available? Because I don't know of any third-party Azure Blob services implementations that are out there. I can't run this, but the reverse engineering that's gone on with S3 has been amazing. I mean, we've got products from the serious players. We've got, all the old school Dell, EMC, the big players are out there. You've got Min.io running around. You've got Scala. I mean, the list of people that have done the work to reverse engineer this and turn it into another product is amazing.
Well,
But there's nobody trying to seriously confront them and say, make this a standard and do the hard work to put it through a standards committee.
Well, this actually sounds an awful lot like the very early days of the PC market, where it was that IBM designed a motherboard for the PCs, and very rapidly people figured out how to clone it and make duplicates of the IBM PC, and there wasn't really any way to change the underlying portion of it because it was what was built into the PC, and it was simply something that people could copy and modify.
Yeah.
And you can't do anything to make it proprietary because everybody knows how to use it.
Well, I don't think you're gonna. I mean, I don't think there's. All this came from. We were sitting in a session yesterday where the idea was effectively let's get everybody together, much including Amazon, and get them to agree to a standard. I don't think you're ever going to get Amazon to agree to it for all the reasons that you listed out. But what I could see happening is all of the other major players in the implementations kind of banding together and, for lack of a better word, taking the opportunity to create a fork and say, this is the way that we're going to go forward and do that together.
Just to add on to Jim's point there, really. So I was talking to one of these object storage vendors last week, and they were bragging about how, they were the closest out of any vendor in the market to S3 compatible, but then they openly held their hands up and said, but we don't actually care about being 100% S3 compatible because so much in there is for Amazon specific. And it kind of touches on the heart of this thing that everyone's rallied around these S3 API calls and kind of making sure that they're much and much the same. But fundamentally, I do think that this S3 compatible is turning into a fork in itself. Everyone's making sure that, okay, we've got these kind of common definitions down. And just like what you said earlier with the whole concept of IBM and a motherboard, I kind of see that we're going to say, okay, S3 compatible, this is the generic standard. We might even start to call it generic S3. And then we've got the Amazon S3, which has all the extra bits they need. And we might start to see it kind of spoken out that way a bit more.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. And I love the name even. I mean, I would absolutely support having there be such a thing as, generic S3 2023 or something like that. It's the basic set of things without all the extra stuff in there. And I mean, the PC thing I think is an interesting point too, because it leads me sort of my next thought on this, which is, so who cares? Like, so what? Is if it's standard or if it's just sort of de facto or de jure. I mean, it doesn't matter which one it is because it's universal and people are fighting to support it and everything, struggling to support it. Does it help the industry or does it harm the industry to have this protocol or interface exist in this way? And just like the PC, I mean, the IBM PC motherboard gave us modern servers. I mean, we wouldn't have everything we have, CXL and, all these other things, and PCI Express, if it wasn't for IBM way back then, kind of building that foundation on which everything is built. And like a ship of Theseus, nothing that remains of IBM is still in that thing. I mean, even the BIOS is gone now, but yet we built on it. And is that what's going to happen with S3? So let me bring that to you. Does it matter if it's a standard for real or if we're just building on it and all struggling together?
I think you still need the standard because in the example of the PC, at the beginning, all the clones was not 100% compatible. 80%, 90%, lot of different vendors. But when standard become, you have a standard card, standard interface, and in this way you can grow and you can make 100% compatible. Otherwise, if you still have this non-compatible part, it can be a limit, and maybe for S3 it can be the same. We need an open S3 or S3 standard just to permit all the product that all the application, because if you do application you can maybe manage, but a lot of product now are using S3 and you need standard to be sure that the behavior is the same if you change the version or the product. Yeah.
Well, my opinion is this. I think there'll be an evolution similar to what you're talking about. There'll be like a generic S3 that all the vendors can rally around. And most importantly, if Amazon would support that, it could be a subset of their superset of S3, and they can still keep their special S3 services internally. And then they can say, oh, that's our differentiator. If you wish to use our S3, we have all these other feature sets that you can have, but you can still have some level of compatibility with a published S3 that's public. And that would be interesting.
One thing I'd just like to add on to that is I really think we're already starting to see this. So there's obviously been some mentions of Veeam earlier on here, but in one of Veeam's latest releases, they actually announced their SOS API or Smart Object Storage API. And we're starting to see that already the way Amazon designed S3 for their consumption doesn't work in all configurations for all purposes. Now, again, that's not the fault of Amazon, because the whole point of this topic is that this is kind of this accidental interface that everyone's rallied around. But when you think about the sheer number of exabytes worth of capacity that, Amazon have. They don't care about things such as, well, we don't care about things such as the amount of available storage they have. We just want to throw files at their storage and trust that as a hyperscaler, they have that capacity. But then when we look at stuff like, the private data center, on-prem, any of that kind of stuff where we're actually responsible for operating the object storage ourselves, then we start to hit on these things such as, well, actually, it does matter the amount of object storage we've got. It does matter that we can report some of these metrics back that Amazon don't need to report to us via the S3 protocol. And now we start to ask for these things. Suddenly, we're asking for something that Amazon doesn't need. So Amazon's not necessarily going to want to be at the helm for this.
Well,
And that's where generic S3 comes from.
well, and I mean, while the idea of a generic S3 is great and it does make sense, one of the more fundamental issues that I think we have, and we've seen this quite a few times, is we don't have a standards-based validation test. So every implementer out there, Minio, whoever, will create their own S3 system. And as you were alluding to earlier, when the test that they were running against doesn't validate what they're trying to prove, they go and spawn a new test. So it might be more efficient if I'm like a SNIA or something like that to put my efforts into creating this is the test, and then work with the client-based vendors, whether it be a Veeam or a whatever, to say, this is what you use to validate and create skill sets.
That's the test-driven development approach. It's don't write the product, define the protocol, define the test. If everybody passes the test, then it should work.
It's funny because I was having a conversation with Rochelle from SNIA the other day, and this is a dynamic that's not a technical problem. The reality, and we're seeing it in the S3 wars, whether it's S3, Azure Blob, whatever, insert S3 clone here, and they're all going to be different, is that commercial storage vendors or cloud vendors have very little incentive anymore to cooperate with one another. They're all looking for market share at the expense of the others. And one way to keep people in your walled garden is to make it harder to get out. I mean, that's what egress fees do, right? Just, and so if someone has written an application stack to your storage service using the APIs that you publish and perhaps have control over, and can adapt at your will, it's going to be much harder for that entity to go and rewrite to be portable somewhere else without, it's just a lot of work, and it's all on the customer side. It's very expensive, painful.
But
So I don't think there's any. So this is going to be, and it's not just in the cloud storage. You're seeing it across the regular storage vendors as well. They have no incentive anymore to adhere to standards, and we're seeing it in SNIA and the different focus of what's going on here. You're seeing a lot more of the low level stuff. You're not seeing, like, SMIS is dead, and Swordfish is around, and everyone's kind of waiting for everybody else to join. It's not happening, right? And this is a dynamic. It's happening more and more now. It's not good for us as a user.
But I disagree with part of that, because Amazon is out there actively partnering with VMware and others to allow portability between Amazon Cloud and on-premises data services as well. And you actually need these APIs to remain constant across both the cloud interfaces and the data center interfaces to allow that portability between the two.
Yeah, but not from one cloud vendor to another cloud vendor.
Not from one cloud vendor to another, but
That's what I mean.
from and you. I mean, you could potentially build up more of the walled garden things to make sure that you can never leave Amazon, but at the same time, they do have to publish these to work with VMware in particular on those vendors.
So to Michael's point, one of the things that I think is not going to be addressed by any of this is this question of the things that would never be found in a hyperscaler. So, for example, why would Amazon want to create a primitive that says I'm running out of space? Like, They're not going to run out of space. Are you kidding me? Why would they want to have a primitive that says, I don't know, port on fire, system down, anything like that? They never want that to happen. So I think objectively you can say that there are going to need to be other elements added to S3 protocol in order to support on-prem and limited size use cases and things. But, Ray?
I think there's a case to be made that if you want to have an ecosystem that really explodes, you need to have effective standard to drive that. I mean, the whole PC thing and the motherboard, when they became a standard motherboard, that whole market just exploded. And I think if you could, and the problem is that Amazon's got such weight and such, so much data that they're controlling and so many applications that they're controlling, it's hard to break away from that. But if you took all the storage vendors and all the other clouds and all the other system vendors out there and said, okay, let's try to make this happen, I think you might be able to do it.
To that kind of point, and fundamentally, when we do talk about hyperscale versus on-prem and things like that, again, we do have this element of, as we kind of touched on earlier, there are some things that, obviously we're beating Amazon over the head a bit here, but there are some things that Amazon don't want, but there's also some things that the on-prem side of things do want. And, to play devil's advocate for a moment, we could even ask the question of, should S3 be something that we're using on-prem when you think about things such as, if you look at iSCSI and the kind of way we've configured storage in the past, we've cared about multipath in one of the things that Stephen kind of touched on earlier is, port on fire. Well, yeah, what if paths are down? All these kind of things that fundamentally we need to control in one way or another. Whereas historically with S3, because it's been that client to service, it's typically been, okay, we're just connecting via some element of WAN interface. And that's been the way we've run it. So, yeah, I do wonder if we might see a necessity to start to split these things out a bit more to cater for the needs of more than just the pure cloud.
Well, it's interesting, just a thought occurred to me in the midst of this when we're talking about parallels between the PC ecosystem and stuff. And I think an actually very, very close example of this is HTML. It's the exact same question. We sort of got the transport protocol down, and what we delivered with it, well, that was a whole other question. And we ended up with some people going, this browser supports the blink tag, this one supports this. And we have the S3 one where we're in the same situation where we have pretty much worked out the kinks on the basics of, yeah, we have a page, we have paragraphs, we have some basics. The S3 basics, I think, are pretty much standardized across all the systems that I don't hear a lot of people complaining about interop problems. All my backup products talk to all my other S3 providers. I haven't had any majors. I can pull a Synology out of a box and back it up to a Ceph-backed French startup doing S3 or Amazon or Blackblaze, and I haven't had any problems lately. So I think we've got enough of that basic down, and we'll have to see where the next stage gets us.
I don't want to be the here, go to him.
Yeah.
I don't want to be the devil's advocate here, Eric, but I think HTML is actually a wonderful analogy for S3 because it's a protocol for something designed by people who don't know anything about that thing, and it ends up being completely bizarre because of that. But anyway.
So the S3 premise that it's okay, I think it's going to unravel as we gain speed and momentum, because look at V12 of Veeam and the offshoot of S3 compatibility for immutability. They abandoned their hardened Linux repository because it's too difficult. They came up with Object First, not directly Veeam didn't create it, but the founders of Veeam created O2B, which is Object First out of the box Object First, and that's S3 compatible. It's immutable. But like I said, I feel that because of the lack of standards and the lack of full API or whatever you want to call it, it's a deprecated subset. And it could be more, and it does a disservice to the organization and IT industry, because if you don't have that communication about that, if you have it, I feel you can grow and make it better for everybody, because then they innovate together. But if you don't have it and you hoard some of it, then it's going to be difficult.
Yeah, I mean, so Eric, I'm going to disagree with you that there are good implementations of S3 as a service, and there are bad ones, and then there are good S3 clients, and there are atrocious ones.
This is true.
And I mean, frankly, you know, connecting a client to Amazon or AWS S3 is a wildly different experience than trying to connect to, say, OpenStack Swift. I mean, these two things are not the same, but they kind of talk the same language. And, you know, at some point, you know, if I'm Amazon, I may look at the fact that it's easier for me to control the client issue by just truly creating an executable client and ditching the API.
Yeah.
And say, this is what I will provide you. And it's available in all these operating systems. Go forth, my child, and have fun. And, you know, and it may be a better implementation because it's a challenge.
You've just described the Amazon outhouse, or I'm sorry, outpost.
Yeah. Yeah.
Nice.
That's still around.
Over the top.
I don't know.
I saw one on the show floor.
So
The world of the VMs.
The other thing I was going to say about this is, you know, I hope really that we've kind of learned from the way we've tried to do things before. If you look at, you know, something that's going on globally at the moment, completely separate to storage here now, is this kind of digitization of voice and moving to SIP. But if you look at, okay, we've got this kind of SIP as, I want to call it a standard, but in the reality, trying to get pretty much any kind of system to talk to each other on it is a mess. And fundamentally, trying to shoehorn all these different compatibilities, you end up with all these different modules on top. And I think that that's just one of the things that, you know, to kind of echo some of the peers' feedback here, is that fundamentally, yeah, I do wonder if we're going to see this standard start to unravel as we have all these different offshoots trying to go in different ways, as vendors try to come up with these unique selling points that are going to break the standard in some way or another to expose some other functionality.
So you're kind of describing the Netscape versus Internet Explorer experience.
The same thing. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
there's
And-
so many examples like Zerto and everything.
And I should correct what I said. It's not that the programmers didn't know anything or didn't care about anything. It's that they were writing an interface for themselves to use. And I think that's the key. You know, the web browser developers were trying to make something that would be easy to render in a web browser because that's what they were building, right? Amazon was trying to make something that integrated well with applications that were running in a cloud service because that's what they were building. They didn't write it to be good at storage because they didn't care about that, because that wasn't the design priority. The design priority was to make it work as an integrated protocol. And I think that ultimately that may be one of the root of some of these concerns and some of these problems. So, you know, we'll see. I mean, I think that safely can say, though, that S3 is an accidental protocol, but it's the protocol we've got. And just like HTML, just like all the rest of this, and just like those, we just need to keep building it and keep helping it to become more mature.
Isn't the history of a lot of technology not the best win, but I don't say the most used, but what can really fit in use cases, in most of use cases, also for the economical part in several choices.
Absolutely. I mean, the best man doesn't usually win in technology.
Yeah.
It's usually the most useful or the most used.
There are 1,000 examples of this
Yes.
technology. Yeah.
So thank you so much.
USB.
This has been a really thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. Thank you for joining us for this Tech Field Day roundtable discussion at Storage Field Day 26. And keep an eye out at the Tech Field Day website for more great roundtable discussions with our delegates.